I will hand it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. Thank you all for attending this webinar. I really do want you to participate in the chat box because well, we're talking about discussions, so and we all need help with it, and we all have useful tips and tricks that we've used. So I hope that you will participate and ask questions, and hopefully get something from this presentation. My name's Brett King. I'm an instructional designer here at CeCE, and discussions are a particular interest of mine, and they're a particularly challenging part of online learning, so that's why we're exploring it today. This session is being recorded, and we will go ahead and share out the resources with you afterwards, just in case you are interested. So the first thing I want you to do is to take a look at this next image, and I'll give you some instructions on it here in just a moment. So thoughts that might come to your mind is difficult, hard to manage. I want you to begin to think about discussions in a different way as far as thinking about just taking what you do in the face-to-face environment and putting it online, and thinking that those two are equivalent or that they are the same. So what I want you to do is to imagine the square peg is face-to-face discussions, and the circle hole is the online learning environment. So if you can imagine hammering that in, you might get most of the way there, but if you'll look and see, there are tons of red shards on the sides here, and that's what happens. We lose a lot whenever we are trying to put things from the face-to-face environment into the online environment without careful design, because they are two different learning environments. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take something, with discussions anyway, we're trying to take something that happens in a classroom spontaneously or organically, and then turning around and mandating and putting rules and regulations and restrictions such as rubrics and things along those lines, which is not necessarily bad, but we're placing it into the online environment, which changes those things. So what we have to do, and the change in the framework that we have to look at, is to create the perfect round peg for the online environment, if that makes sense. So to further illustrate this, I did a comparison. And if you look on the left-hand side, you see the face-to-face environment. And this is what we typically think of when we think of a discussion in the classroom. You'll see the professor or instructor leading a discussion, and he may comment or ask questions to each individual student in the classroom. And then they're going to respond to each other, and they're going to comment each other, and the professor will help guide them. He'll encourage them. He will tell them when they, are missing something or doing something wrong. And there's this very organic process when the discussions are done in the face-to-face environment. Now, we look over to the right-hand side and we see what it looks like. We now have very regimented questions. There's also a word response. They have to say 150 words. They have to be grammatically sound, and they have to clearly articulate their thoughts without, mumbling or saying ums and ahs and those sorts of things, right? And they have to comment on at least 2 other posts. And then there's a rubric associated with it, and then they're going to get a grade. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference between the two. And whenever we're doing discussions in the face-to-face environment, we don't hand out a rubric or we don't hand out criteria for the discussion. We just have the discussion, and students will get some sort of participation points or engagement points for participating. So what I want you to begin to think about is how you design face-to-face discussions versus how you design and work through online discussions, because they are so different. So next, I want to talk about some myths about discussions, and there are just a few here. And one of them is the more discussions equals more engagement. We often think that if students are engaging in discussions or participating in discussions, that they are in fact engaged, and that's a myth. And in fact, I would argue that 3 to 4 really well-designed discussions outweigh 12 or more poorly designed discussions. And there's also an assumption that you can place discussions in the online environment and just let them happen. And it requires less interaction from you. And this is not true. The students need to see that you're engaged and that you care about the discussions and are looking at the discussions, so that they feel engaged and that you're contributing to it, and they'll contribute to it. Imagine if you're in the face-to-face environment and you're holding a discussion in the classroom, and for 30 minutes you never say anything or comment or make any suggestions or tell somebody that's a good comment or anything along those lines. It's going to get a bit awkward. So it's nice to go in and give feedback, and be a part of the discussions yourselves. And what we've already talked about, that they are different from the face-to-face. Any questions so far? Okay. Oh. All right. Don, you're good. Okay. Well, feel free to post them. So the next thing is I'm going to break down discussions into 3 parts, and we're going to go into some specifics of tips and tricks on how to complete each part. So I broke it down into 3 parts: designing, facilitating, and evaluating. Designing is all of your front work that you do in discussions. Facilitating is the part that you do before you evaluate. It's the guiding, providing formative feedback, encouraging, all those things. And then, of course, evaluating is where you give a grade. So I want to take a quick poll of those who are participating and see what you struggle with the most or what you think is the most challenging. So give me just a moment. So let me know if you can see the poll. Okay, looks like most of the participants have contributed. Designing and evaluating for most. Facilitating, Kenny, yeah. Yeah, rubrics are difficult, but we can help you with that here if you need anything, Bill. Okay, so I want to broadcast the results really quick. And hopefully you guys are able to see that. If you can't see it, okay, very good. So you can see they're designing got the top rank, facilitating next, and then evaluating next. So that kind of gives me an idea of what you're looking for and what you struggle with the most. Designing obviously is a very challenging piece, but I will say that facilitating is an often missed piece. So it's not very difficult, but it is often missed. So we'll get into that here in just a moment. So I'm going to end the poll real quick. Thank you guys for doing that. Okay. So I created this little chart or graphic to kind of represent the different elements that are involved in a discussion. It's by no means comprehensive, but if you begin to ask yourself these questions, how am I going to design this discussion? How am I going to facilitate it? And how am I going to evaluate it? Um, this will get you on the right track with discussions. And I would never say that discussions should be something that you should not, you know, obviously spend a lot of time on, because they do require work, and they require work upon you, and they require work upon the students, on a really good discussion board. Um, but I think if you begin to look at the process and truly think about, design, you're going to spend obviously the bulk of your critical thought there and thinking about how students might interact, by choosing the activity, creating your questions, and then going back. Often people forget to align them. If you'll see there, my step 5 is align. Going back and taking your activity, taking your questions and the assessment, and making sure that it aligns back with your central objectives of your course or your objectives for the module. Um, and making sure that you're actually evaluating and helping students learn those objectives, and that you're not just having them discuss, to complete the module. There are some ideas in there with the types. The types are simply types of discussions that you can do, and the characteristics are the characteristics that should be within a discussion. So discussion should be relevant, personal, high on Bloom's taxonomy as far as questioning is concerned, and the activities they're doing. Everything else, I don't want to read everything else on the discussion process. Does that all make sense to you guys? Okay, great. And again, if you're interested in this, it'll be shared with you later. Again, this is just a way for you to kind of further your discussions and, think about it, mentally plan for discussions as you're designing them. So we're going to go through some tips. I have tips for design, tips for facilitate, and tips for evaluating. So designing tips. These are just general things that I often see missed in discussions, and that the research says is a good practice in discussions. I think really, if I had one motto, I think as I'm designing or helping faculty members design, discussion boards and thinking about it, is to be explicit versus implicit. Um, Make sure that your discussions, have enough detail in them so that students can know what's expected. Um, and then if you want students to be free in the discussion board and to, you don't want to have too regimented of an environment, then simply state that. If you really are allowing for that creativity, then encourage it and give them tools and online tools to, allow them to be more creative with their responses. You would be surprised by providing those tools how much students will open up and be creative, because they're digital natives. I mean, they know technology, and it's growing more and more where, they're going to be able to represent themselves other than just text. So allowing them to record a video or, creating an infographic or a voice recording might be a good opportunity to, get students involved in discussion boards. And I think if we can make discussion boards on the piece there where I'm talking about relevant and personal, is if we can make them relevant or applicable, and personal to students, they're more likely to be engaged and have an investment in your discussion boards. So if they can apply it to a skill that they're learning, or if they can apply it to a future job or to something in their life that they might be going through, that's going to further engage them into the discussion board. And I'll show you an example later, where I'm actually taking a typical discussion board and showing how you can, transfer it over and make it more relevant and personal to students. And the other thing I would say about, designing tips is to ask open-ended questions. You see there I gave a couple examples, but try to ask open-ended questions that will make students give different responses. Even if you can encourage students to have um, conflict or a disagreement, that's going to cause students to kind of come in and engage with each other and truly care about a discussion because they have a point to come across and they have a justification for it. So those would be some designing tips for you. Okay, next up is facilitating tips. I think we had just a couple respondents say that they struggle with facilitating. This is one of the most underutilized steps in the discussion boards. As I was talking about earlier in the misconceptions or myths about discussion boards, it's that faculty members have to step back and not participate, otherwise the discussions will shut down. Where if you come in to a discussion board and you make a definitive post, that then yes, you will shut down the discussion board. But you can go into a discussion board and provide positive feedback. You can encourage your students. You can provide critical questioning to your students. Um, all these things make connections to the content for students. All these things help your learners connect to the content and also get some sort of reinforcement and encouragement throughout the course. Because besides this area and direct feedback and drop boxes and other areas, perhaps emails, they're not getting a lot of praise and a lot of encouragement throughout the course. So, and this is a way to provide public encouragement and to say great job on the post. I like how you mentioned so and so or such concept, or this is a really interesting concept. You know, go out and post another resource for them to look at. Um, these things are time consuming for you as a faculty member, but they're invaluable to learners. And what you may not value as necessarily important is really important to the learners and how they persist and feel about the learning environment that you're creating. So I will leave it at that. And finally, we're going to move on to evaluating tips. Um, Evaluating is, especially if you have a lot of discussion boards, can be a real challenge. If you have, 8 to 10, even more discussion boards within a learning environment and you're trying to go through and grade all those, and if you have a class of 25 or more, it's going to be difficult to keep up with everything, depending on the learning environment. But I would say that if you don't have rubrics, at least create some grading expectations on your side and for the learners to see. That way you can quickly go through and see if learners are matching up to what you're expecting them to do. So I'm not, if you're a proponent of rubrics, that's great. If you're not, I'm not saying that you have to use them, but what I would say is that have a clear guidelines for grading, however you want to do that. The feedback that you provide should be often, and evaluation should be quick, so that learners are not waiting to receive that type of feedback. And then it should be in depth for them. It should be so that they can take that and take that feedback and apply it somewhere else in the course. We don't see this done very often or often enough, especially with larger classes, but peers can evaluate each other and or they can evaluate themselves. What you have to allow for in the first couple modules is for them to practice doing that and then model it for them, show them how to do it. And this can be an especially useful tool for classes that need a lot of collaboration or a lot of group work. This will be a useful tool to do that with. So those are the three areas and the three tips I gave you, or some tips for each area. Do you guys have any questions about any of those tips that I gave you? Okay, I'm glad you're getting some good ideas. Um, so I've got about 10 minutes left and just a few more slides, a couple more slides. So we'll try to save some time at the end. Um, I will say in the next slide, I'm expecting you guys to share some. So hopefully you guys have some good thoughts here. Oh, I'm gonna step back here real quick and look at Kenny's. Yeah, Kenny, you can embed the rubrics within discussion boards. And you and I won't go too far into that, but you can attach them to the discussion boards and get those to upload straight to the gradebook. So um, we can touch base and exchange emails later for that. All right. So the next thing is tools. So there are a lot of tools out there um, for discussion boards and in general in online learning. I've picked out two here to emphasize on because they are relatively new. While I'm talking here, I'd like for you guys to share out any tools that you use in the discussion in the chat box and any tools that you use in discussions particularly because we're always looking for good ways to do that. So the first one I'm going to mention is Perusal. Um, and this is an excellent tool. It actually allows you to annotate within Word documents online and allows you to, there we go. So if you can see there, I highlighted this area within a document and then I made a comment over here. And then I gave myself a little high five. You can actually enroll entire courses into Perusal, multiple students, and let them discuss in the text. They can post links, videos, anything. You can see there the little interface they have there, images, and the students can go in and comment and discuss the text that you actually place in there. You can place PDFs, you can place actual full textbooks within Perusal. So it's a great software. The wonderful thing about Perusal is it's actually free for now for both the student and the faculty member. Um, and I I think if you have a reading intensive course that requires students to discuss certain text, I think Perusal is a great tool for that. And it does integrate into LMSs, so that's a nice thing. Um, just taking a look over here at the chat box. Yeah, Don. So Don, feel free to give a review or further intricacies about Flipgrid, but so Flipgrid is a video discussion software that allows students to record videos back and forth to each other using their phones or iPads or on the computer, and allows you to give restrictions as far as the time they have to respond. And if you'll look down here, these are all the responses, and here's the question that was posted. It's a great tool. However, it does come at a cost. And Don, I believe the cost is $65 a year for educators still? Yeah. So, which is a pretty good price if you think about what you can do with your students and allowing them to do video responses in that type of manner. Um, I would say that D2L offers the video capability as well if you're here using it at UCO, um, but it doesn't have quite the interface and flexibility of Flipgrid. Um, okay, yeah, slack.com. Very good. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, VoiceThread. A number of people use VoiceThread. That's a great tool. Any others? Okay, so yeah, so if you guys want any more information about Perusal or Flipgrid, feel free to go online and search. But if you need any help from any of us at CeCE, feel free to contact us about those. We're happy to help you get those set up and integrated. So I want to move on to my last slide here, and that is examples. So hopefully you can see here just a little bit of what I'm trying to show. So here on the left-hand side, we have a typical discussion about readings. It's a very familiar grading criteria, clearly articulates thoughts. This is the most common thing we see, right, is to have students comment and post on at least 2 other posts. This is not necessarily a bad technique, especially if it currently works for you. But what can sometimes happen with the example from one is that you can start getting the same thing over and over again, or you're finding that your responses are no longer original or thought-provoking. So what I did was I flipped it around and I tried to apply some of the principles that we've been talking about today. So the first changeover was not too much. Identify and provide a brief history of the central topic and why it's relevant today. So students, if you can somehow find that it is important or applicable today, that's going to be more likely for them to care about it, because that means they're going to have to go out and think about how this applies to their lives today. This one here is very direct, how this is connecting it to their personal life experiences. Again, telling them, okay, this is important to talk about, and it's important for them to understand how it relates to their own life. Last one I changed was I wanted them to provide a justification for the counterpoint. A lot of times students will give a justification for their view, or give a counterpoint, but they won't provide a justification or reasoning. This is reaching into a higher level of Bloom's and require them to have a higher level of thinking to actually justify that counterpoint. And then I also allowed them to record video or audio in their post response. I think allowing them to do that is a perfect thing to do in a discussion board, because in the classroom they're giving that type of response orally versus actually giving it in a text base. I know I speak better orally than I do in a text base. I can better articulate my thoughts. And then what I also did is I also removed much of the grading criteria. The 150 word post went away here, and the grammatically sound. And that's, again, totally up to you. The reason I did it here was because I'm trying to look at what I'm expecting. And I expect my students to be able to clearly articulate their thoughts. If they can do that in 50 words, that's great. If they can do it in 300 words, that's also great. But I want them to be able to have the freedom to post however they want. And if a student posts 30 words and does it and answers those questions, then they're going to receive the same grade as somebody who gives a longer response. But I will be grading them, the same way. And then you see down there this question response criteria changed there. I asked them to, instead of posting comments, I asked them to post questions, so that students are actually getting asked questions, having to go back in and clarify their responses and misunderstandings. So again, I'm trying to get them to critically think about their responses. So do you guys have any questions or even examples of things that you do in your classroom before we close up here? So I'm going to stay after, but this is the closing of the webinar because it is 12:30, so I want to make sure and be respectful for your time. But I will go ahead and stay afterward and answer just those questions there. Would adding discussion, participation, grading criteria in the course syllabus be a good substitute? Yeah, I would say that grading, adding it in there would be a great way to do it because then students know that that you're paying attention to the discussion boards. So I think that's an excellent thing to do. You're very welcome. Feel free to reach out if you have questions.